If you're a dev tool, your default is probably to create all your own SDKs, but you might also wonder if sometimes you're signing yourself up for unnecessary pain. Today's guest is Sid Maestre, who worked in DX at PayPal and Xero and hosts the Art of Developer Experience podcast, and is also a DevRel at APIMatic, which is a DX API platform. We talk about when to build your own SDK. We talk about the open source tools available for building APIs, a lot of which I didn't know. And we also talk about how AI has impacted APIs and developers in general. Enjoy.
But Xero is, you were saying like Xero is like, they saw that APIs were going to be like really important, even though we're an accounting platform, but APIs are going to be useful because our partners are going to build on top of Xero and like add all this value to our customers. And I've met people building like Xero add-ons, and I know like how big of an ecosystem that is. So that must have been like a really big part of the growth, I would imagine.
Yeah. I think if you can imagine what life was like before we started moving a lot of these applications from our desktop to the cloud, if you had a desktop accounting software package that you installed, how difficult it was to move data in and out of that software. They had these import, export sort of menu items, and the formats were always tough to wrangle, and it was very time consuming, and people just spent a lot of time shuffling data back and forth. And APIs really unlocked the ability to do that in real time, even if that was what you needed. And it was much more stable and reliable. And yeah, I think the team that's founded Xero were very forward thinking in that way, and they kind of saw the wave of what was going on with Salesforce and companies like that, and they just saw it as an opportunity to disrupt the existing incumbent accounting software that was out there.
Yeah. Do you get a sense, like, is this kind of like secondary, I don't know, like this, like a developer plus, you called it, like economy, is that, would you say, is bigger than like the DevTools economy, or is it like sort of, do you think it's like that world is bigger, or like, is it?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think that in the past, platforms would get would hit critical mass, and you'd get this flood of developers wanting to build on top of it. I think I mentioned Shopify, Salesforce, Xero was definitely part of that as well. And I think that as time goes on, being able to find that niche application that you can build and connect to it becomes harder to identify and actually monetize to the point that a developer can feel like it's worth the investment building. Who knows, maybe AI is going to make that a lot cheaper to build, and therefore the economics are going to make that a better proposition. I think that you get these big tentpole companies like that. Facebook, remember, had their platform play as well for a while with games and things like that. But I feel like DevTools is like 1,000 or hundreds of thousands of opportunities and open source. Like, I think that there's probably a lot more activity going on in that space because you don't have to be locked in and, unfortunately, constrained perhaps by the limitations of the platform that you bought into. If you become a Shopify app developer, then you have to play by Shopify's rules, and you have to adhere to their terms of use and all those sort of things. So there's definitely limitations. While if you're building your own dev tool to solve some kind of problem, then there's a lot less constraints on that, and maybe you can do things the way you want to as a company.
Yeah, it makes sense. Like, and I guess there's only like a few platforms that like big enough that you would, yeah, as you said, I think tempo, we called them, like big enough that people actually want to develop on top of them, like tie their career. Because I guess it also involves like, you know, like Salesforce, like you have like the Salesforce developers, and I suppose Xero, you probably get like experts in Xero APIs, and they build agencies and stuff like that.
This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. At some point, you're going to land a big customer and they're going to ask you for enterprise features. That's where WorkOS comes in, because they give you these features out the box. Features like skim provisioning, SAML authentication, and audit logs. They have an easy-to-use API, and they're trusted by big dev tools like Vercel, as well as smaller, fast-growing dev tools like Knock. So if you're looking to cross the enterprise chasm and make yourself enterprise ready, check out WorkOS. We've also done an episode with Michael, the founder of WorkOS, where he shares a lot of tips around crossing the enterprise chasm, landing your first enterprise deals, and making sure that you're ready for them. Thanks, WorkOS, for sponsoring the podcast, and back to the show.
Yeah, I think that those companies that build those kind of platforms have to be really successful with their core product to have a customer base that's large enough for developers to benefit from. And I think that's part of the attraction for developers, is they've got a built-in audience. If you're building a dev tool, you have to go and create that audience, or you have to find that audience and connect with it. And that is not always the strong suit of engineers, right? Is the marketing side of things. So it's a shortcut, but there's trade-offs in going with more of a platform developer tool.
Yeah, 100%. Yeah. I follow some of the like indie hacker communities, and some of them are like, for kind of indie hackers, it's like actually better to just build inside an ecosystem, start building, Trello. We've had someone on who was building like Trello power-ups, and, it's great because you kind of, in some ways, the distribution is like taken care of. But then it's like, is there like a VC backed, like enormous opportunity? It's like harder to see that because you're probably not going to eclipse like the whale that you're like, you're like the barnacle on the whale kind of thing. Like,
yeah, I think, well, WordPress, right? Plugins, right? That was really popular for a while. I think part of what you can do, if you do go that route, is the companies, the people inside those companies that are fostering and building ecosystems like I did at Xero, we get really excited when there are developers that are all in on our APIs and our platform. If they are like, if you can build those relationships, if you're excited about the opportunity and you really foster it, you can get a lot of benefits from being the rock star in that community, but that's an investment. And if you extend the platform in a way that ultimately could or should be core to the product, then you got pluses and minuses to that. The plus is maybe they acquire you, right? And you become part of their bigger product. It cuts the other way, where if there's 6 of you all trying to fill that core need, only one of you might get acquired and the other 5 are now left in the cold because the acquired version becomes the default. So another thing to consider when you're looking to build tools is what's the landscape and how likely is it for a platform to disrupt me in my efforts.
They just add a feature and then like you're like irrelevant at that point, because why do I go to the extension store when like it's just there? Like I can do it already. It's like I'll give you an example where it turned out positive. Xero didn't have much of an inventory solution, and so they added I would call very basic inventory functionality.
And we had inventory app partners, but they were so focused on and going so deep on that topic of inventory, which I didn't understand how complex that can be, but it can be very complex, especially in a online, offline retail environment where you've got inventory you need to manage that you're selling through multiple channels. Like there's all kinds of complexity. Xero wasn't interested in solving that. So even launching an inventory feature didn't really negatively impact the app partners there. So it's like knowing like how you fit into the puzzle and knowing that you're adding value in a deep and meaningful way for customers means that you've got more security long term.
Yeah, that makes sense. Yeah, one of the things I wanted to ask you, because obviously you're with APIMatic and it's a developer experience platform, really helps with APIs. But then we've got like Stripe. I think recently it's like 70 billion valuation. And a big part of that I think is that they're famous for developer experience. And I think for them, they probably you can correct me on this, is like I think a lot of it's like build in house. And then there's this kind of like trade-off of like, should we build everything in house, or can we actually get a better experience by buying? I wonder if you could talk a bit about like the build versus buy in terms of APIs, because I know this is something that you think a lot about.
Yeah. I think we all have a lot of respect for what Stripe has built in the developer tool space. We often will quote them around why they built SDKs, which they have right in their developer docs, which is they want to reduce the amount of boilerplate code that developers have to write and maintain. That's why they have built them. And they've got a really robust developer experience. And like you said, to my knowledge, they've built that all in-house, and they built it up over a long period of time. I imagine they've invested millions and millions of dollars. And yet we all aspire and want to have that if we have an API that we're taking to market. So the question is build versus buy. I think it depends a lot on, there's lots of factors. I would say the stage of your company, the maturity of your APIs. I think you definitely have to know, you definitely have to achieve that product market fit with your APIs before you start thinking that you want to have the same DX as Stripe. You need to have, great API documentation, of course. You need to have some good way to onboard those initial first 100 developers. But you probably don't have a huge catalog of APIs. It just depends on the company and where you are, what stage you're at when you're releasing them.
I was going to say, like, OpenAI kind of had like theirs was so limited for such a long time, but it was just like they had such a strong PMF that didn't matter, because it was like everyone would just figure out how to do it anyway.
Yeah. I think that's an interesting thing about APIs is like, how excited are developers? What use cases are you solving for? What's the competition like? Those factors can really drive how much you invest in your DX. And so, like, I'll give, we'll stick with the Stripe example. There's a lot of great payment APIs out there now that are similar to Stripe, and yet some are doing things that are very different in the payment space. You get companies like Adyen, who have built up really strong reputation, PayPal, Square, so you've got the original players, you've got, ones that are going after the point of sale, right? Square is known for their point of sale, but they also have great APIs. So they are also, they're competing on product features or API features, but they're also competing on the DX. And I think to come back to your question of build versus buy, I think everything's a trade-off, and you just need to figure out for example, what level of control do you think that you need in your DX? Like, do you need to control every single pixel? Do you need to control every line of code in the libraries you give developers? I think Square or Stripe has a bit of that in their DNA, where they have such a strong opinion on everything that I think that they feel like they have to have that level of control. I also think that they have to hire a lot of experts, people with a lot of language expertise, and have them on staff, and they have to continue to invest in resources to build that DX. If you are budget constraint, I think we've seen a lot of this in tech where people are being asked to do more with less. I think that if you have a limited headcount, are you going to have your engineers building new features on your platform and your APIs? Or are you going to have them building your own custom CMS for your documentation and your SDKs, if there are also good open source and commercial solutions out there? So there's all these trade-offs, I think, that come into play. And I sort of see it as three options. You can build everything yourself. You can buy, full out, get a commercial product, and there's lots of them out there, like APIMatic. Or you can try to split the difference and say, I'm going to go with open source, which is, quote unquote, free, but in a way you're both buying and building, right? You're buying it in the sense that you're buying into that ecosystem with all of the pluses and minuses of an open source project, and the direction it goes and what features it has and the bugs that exist, and you still have control. You can kind of influence that to some degree, but you're hiring engineers to contribute to that open source project and maintain that tool chain in-house. And so I've worked with OpenAPI Generator, for example. So we've had to modify templates and get really skilled with Mustache, and we weren't all language experts, we weren't PHP experts, for example. So we had to go back and forth with our developer community. So there's all these trade-offs. When you go the commercial route, you're basically hiring a team of experts who 24/7 are thinking about developer documentation, and they're thinking about SDKs, and they're thinking about what's the next feature of DX that our customers might want, and let's go and build that so they don't have to. So we're doing that with AI and things like that inside of our docs. So there's all kinds of pluses and minuses, and then you have to wait for that commercial company to ship that. So like you can't you can push for it. You can try and get it prioritized on the roadmap, and we do that with some of our customers. But there's all these trade-offs.
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think when you were saying that, one of the things I was thinking of, is it partly if your SDKs and your docs and your how they use it is your core proposition. It's if your core thing is that is so innovative, and it's shockingly good, and Stripe, they have their they surprise you with the test payments, and you can see the stuff inline and how it works and stuff like that. And when no one had ever done that before, that's okay, if you're trying to do that sort of thing, probably you're going to just build it because probably doesn't exist. But then if it's if your innovation is elsewhere and you just want that part to be really good, but not completely novel, then you're maybe going to look at buying. Is that sort of and obviously there's the other trade-offs around constraints around how much budget you've got, how many people you've got to work on it, that sort of stuff.
Yeah. I think if you've got a process in place where as your API changes, you're able to keep your documentation up to date and things like that. Keeping SDK libraries up to date can be challenging in itself. And I would say, I'd step back and say, what do giving developers libraries, what does that do for you? Well, when we've talked to our customers, we found that if you don't have them, what you end up doing is you end up devoting a lot of energy and resources to supporting and answering developers' questions because they're having to roll their own solutions and they're having to write all that code from scratch. And so you end up having a higher level of support, especially if you have anything unusual or complex. Like I've seen authentication that is non-standard in different ways, and that complexity can be harder for developers. Or I don't know if you've dealt with uploading binary data through a multi-form sort of interface. Like depending on the language, that can be straightforward, or it can be a little tricky, or a little touchy, where you just get something just wrong, the spacing just wrong in that header signature, and it just doesn't work. And you can spend hours as a developer trying to figure that out versus a library that's been tested and it works. So support is one issue. The other thing is, if you are onboarding developers successfully and then waiting for months and months and months for them to actually build a production grade integration with all the tests around it that they need, with all the additional functionality beyond just making an API call. Like, what happens if the API call fails? Do you have retries? What happens if you time out? What happens if it gets into some kind of state where it's constantly retrying? Do you have a circuit breaker or something? Like, there's all kinds of things that you can get out of the box with a commercial SDK solution that if you don't provide it, developers who are trying to build really robust and reliable integrations, because this is what they're putting in front of their customers and they care deeply about their customers' experience, they're going to have to build a lot of that machinery themselves and then maintain it. So those are the two things we see: support and just how long it takes for things to get built. And if you're monetizing your API and it takes 6 or 9 months for an integration to get built, that's time that you're not monetizing your API, because there are no production API calls happening. They're living in the sandbox and you're just waiting and waiting for them to launch. And that can be pretty important if it's a high volume customer or partner that's going to be using your APIs.
Yeah, that makes sense. And it feels like it's one of those things as well, where it's like you're going to just be constantly like you're adding features. Like I was talking to some guys yesterday about like their pricing, and there's always like every line in their pricing is because someone came along and started like, doing something very odd, and then like suddenly they had to change the pricing model because someone was like costing them so much money. And it's like, it feels like it might be that sort of thing where it's like you start out with the basics and it's like, okay, so then someone needs the retry, so you built that, and then someone needs, there's the circuit breaker, you built that, and then someone needs like this specific type of like authentication, or like, you just keep adding it. Whereas I guess like you probably get a lot further without having to keep doing those things, I would imagine.
Yeah. I think a big one in the last few years has been OpenAPI supporting polymorphism, and therefore a property could be a string or it could be an object, like the full object itself. So it could be the contact ID or it could be a full contact object, and the API will accept both. And how that gets when you're generating docs and and generating code, docs don't need to compile. So you can sort of handle some of that polymorphism in your documentation, and some do it better than others. But then when you want to generate code, like, you need to make sure your engines can handle some of that complexity in your API. And that's been something that has to be tackled by a lot of these engines in the last couple of years. So that's as our API designs change and evolve, then the tools have to catch up and match some of those design patterns.
Yeah. And actually, like if someone's not buying and they just kind of want to use like the best like open source tools and stuff, like are there any that you? I mean, I guess this is going to partly depend like by language and stuff, but are there any things that people should look at that they might not have been aware of? Because I recently went and met your colleague Sahib at the API Days conference, and there were like so many tools, and he was talking about things that I had never really heard of, but like people who spend all their time on APIs are like very, very aware of. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah. I feel like I've been living in a little bit of a bubble where we all talk the same language, and then you get out of your bubble and you realize, I'm really deep in it. I think that's a great question that you're asking. I think for DX and for helping with API consumption, if you don't have to handcraft things, then you want to look for ways to automate them, right? And the way that we automate things around APIs is with OpenAPI, formerly known as Swagger. And if you go and look out at the ecosystem that's been built around that specification standard, there is a huge number of tools, probably more, definitely more than 5 years ago when I got started. And so I would say what I didn't know 5 years ago and that I preach today is make sure that your API specification is well linted and validated for the uses that you intend. So if you're looking to generate docs, sorry, you can ask a question?
No, I was just going to say, and just maybe we should just in case anyone's not used Swagger or like specifications, maybe we just say exactly what that is as well.
Yeah, no problem. Yeah. So OpenAPI is not an API. It's a standard with which you can describe your API. So you would, it's machine readable, but it's also like humans can read it as well, but it's really great for machines. So if you have specific endpoints, you would document those following the OpenAPI standard. If there are requests and response objects, you would define those. If you have a specific security scheme like OAuth 2 or basic auth, you can define that, and you can tell which endpoints are secured using those different things. So at a very high level, it's a description language. Does that maybe that'll help? Hopefully that'll help folks kind of orient. Yeah. So with an OpenAPI file, you can do first of all, you can design your API, which means you can actually understand and think through how the API will work before you write any code. You can mock your API and put it in front of customers, which I've seen done and at companies that I've worked at. And it's amazing for our product manager to get feedback before, again, any code's been written, and you can adjust the design. And then I've not done this. I know that some people will use it to generate some of the server-side, stubs, some of the server-side code. I've not done that myself, but I know that there's some tooling out there that you can use to do that, and then you can use it to generate other things, documentation, SDKs. So to answer your question, if I were starting, I'd want to make sure that my OpenAPI definition, because there's, how do I put this? You can create a totally valid OpenAPI spec that doesn't generate really great code because you've done things in a way like when you lint it, if the linter doesn't tell you that you have to have all the descriptions or all the examples, then when you generate the code, you may not have the examples to generate tests that test that code. If you name your models, if you name your methods something really like not intuitive for developers, it's going to generate methods in your library that aren't readable. So there's a definite design eye that you have to put towards these. And there's tools out there like Spectral that's open source. Redoc has a good linting tool, but those tools are great for linting if you're generating docs. I think APIMatic might be the first company, maybe only company, that's released a VS Code extension that has 1,200 linting rules specifically to lint your OpenAPI definition so it generates better code. So whether you choose to use APIMatic or not, if you're looking to generate code, I would go and, if you use VS Code, go to the marketplace. It's free. Download the APIMatic VS Code extension and open up your API definition in there and see what sort of linting and validation issues it detects, and see how close you are to being able to generate code. So to me, that's step one. Step two is to actually go and generate the code.
Sorry, Sid, just on that, like, just the thing that made it, that crystallized it with me on that part was that, like, you can do stuff like, plurals and things, right? So, like, if you had, like, your path and you were like, the API that fetches all the chocolates available, and, like, at one like, you had, like, the path was like chocolate, and then the next time you did it, like, you were like, crisps. Potato chips for the Americans, and then you were like potato chip or something. I don't know. Maybe that's a bad example because it's the plural is the thing. But like you can do stuff like that, right? So that you're not like you're actually keeping it consistent across. Those are the kind of things that you would lint.
Yes, you could. You can. Okay, so if you don't give an operation ID, because it's not required that you have an operation ID for every path, for every method on your path. So you've got a get, a put, a post on a path. If you don't put an operation ID, then the machine, whether it's documentation or code generation, is going to try to infer what to call that. And so they'll probably call it something like post chocolate. But you might actually say, I actually want it to be create chocolate. So if you leave out the operation ID, then you get whatever the machine gives you, and it'll do its best. It's a machine. But if you want to be very specific about your DX, then you don't want to forget that operation ID. That's just one small example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it makes sense. And I think the big takeaway I used OpenAPI for the first time recently. Guilty of not using it, and I think it's kind of annoying to do it and to maintain it, to be completely honest. But it's like it's worth it. It feels like to just do it and like have like consistency across it, like even just for like internal projects, like where you're not putting it out to the public.
I'm curious, what tool did you use to edit and create it?
I did it all like completely raw. I raw dogged it, as they would say. Like I think I was honestly relying a lot on like the generated, like to using like Cursor to actually generate a lot of the actual specs. And I think I was using this tool that would generate a documentation page, but I had to remove it because it was blowing up Sneak with like vulnerabilities. So then I think I can't even remember how I did it, but like I didn't use any library, and I was able to just like display like docs from the spec. And that was the main reason we did it, was to just have some docs to like hand over to a different team, basically.
Yeah. Wow. Well, if it makes you feel any better, years ago when I was at Xero, we didn't have a Swag. It was Swagger 2, and they were transitioning to OpenAPI 3. We didn't have anything really, and so I basically hand-coded, reverse engineered from existing documentation the OpenAPI file, and it I got really comfortable in YAML, but it was really a massive like ongoing project that just took a long time to do that. And so it's interesting to hear that that you didn't use something like Spectral or some of these other tools that I think have come out since then that are making it even easier to create these sort of things.
Well, there you go. So that's a lesson for someone else. They can learn from my misery that you check out Spectral or something if you're going to try.
Sorry. I shouldn't say Spectral. Spotlight created Spectral. Spotlight, which is now part of Smart. Which is they were bought by Smart Bear, so like the names keep changing. Okay. So, but yeah, Swagger Hub and those sort of UI tools have made all of this a lot easier.
That's cool.
Yeah.
And then, sorry, you and I did interrupt you. I think you were saying something before.
Oh yeah. Well, to get back to your original question is like, once you've got an API, open API definition that's in good shape, I always feel like there's not really the perfect tool out there. It's the perfect tool for you. And so if you are looking to just generate one language, then you might go and find an open source project that's purpose built for that one language and try it out. See what the code is like. I think all the commercial tools out there have some kind of free trial. APIMatic has a free trial. Just go in, import it, and generate some SDKs and see how the code looks. I think there's a level of trust that these tools have to overcome. I think that developers are naturally skeptical, especially with code gen. Maybe that's shifting with AI, maybe not. Maybe people still don't trust AI completely. But I think that people have over time gotten more confident that the code that comes out is quality code and doesn't have a lot of bugs and, actually functions. Like I'll be honest, I did try some tools years ago, and I would generate in some language, and I'd go to try to compile it, and it wouldn't compile. And I'd find out it was because there was something in my spec that the machine didn't like. Maybe there was a space or a special character that I had in the name of something and that debugging process can be kind of frustrating. So if it works right out of the box, then that's a good sign that the tool is at least worth exploring further. And so it's good to kind of put them through their paces in an afternoon.
Yeah, that fits with what I've seen. And so to transition quickly from OpenAPI to the often confused OpenAI. I feel like people say that all the time. So what kind of things are going on with AI now, with APIs, like some kind of considerations that people should be thinking about?
Yeah, I think I feel like we're 2 years in on this AI revolution. I mean, of course, machine learning's been around forever, or for a long time, and we used it at Zero and things like that internally. But I'd say the first year of really broad usage of AI, I think that there were a lot of experiments and people trying to do things with AI around APIs that the results weren't really great. I think in the second year, things have gotten much, much better, and you're definitely seeing tools that are helping you at least create that initial cut of an open API definition. I'm seeing people using it for fixing your open API. I've also seen it when it comes to developer experience. People are using it to consume your documentation and basically enabling like a chatbot that developers can ask questions. And some people are doing that in more of a let's hook into Zendesk and let's hook into your forums and let's consume all of that and make the model trained. Let's train the model on everything about your documentation. At APIMatic, we've been doing our own experiments in that space as well. But we're really focused on the fact that we generate SDKs and code examples, and we generate guided walkthroughs, and we generate a lot of artifacts that are code centric, and so our AI models are built that when a developer asks a question about how do I do X, it actually generates, I say synthesizes code that doesn't exist anywhere based off of the SDKs that we've generated. So the import statements are importing our libraries, and it's generating code for developers to stitch together 2, 3, 4 API calls into a piece of integration code that a developer could copy and paste into their IDE and run. So that's some of the ways that I've seen it, both internally at APIMatic and also out in the community. But I feel like there's even more opportunity. I think there's going to be more innovation when we get into year 3 here.
Yeah, it does feel like it's all just going to kind of completely change. It's hard to tell how.
Yeah, I'm really curious to see how engineering's changing. I'm wondering what your opinion is on the AI tooling and how, like, what's going to be the big impact when it comes to how AI helps write code. Have you given that much thought?
Yes, and I've asked quite a lot of people, and I've asked. I asked a similar question to Swix, who's like very big in the AI space, runs the Late in Space podcast, and I also asked Kenneth Alschenberg, who was like he was on the team of VS Code, and like I think led DX at Stripe, and it was like thinks about this a lot. And I think the short answer is like they didn't know. They were like, yeah, we have like thoughts, but like it's so hard to tell what's going to happen. And on a micro basis, I can only speak for myself. And like some days I use Cursor and it's like amazing, and I think this is great. And then other days I'm like, this is just like AI code sucks. Like it sends me down rabbit holes. Like I just waste more time. I'm more effective if I just don't use it. Like I kind of like bounce back and forth. And I feel like it will have a huge impact, and it already is. But I'm very unsure on like the role of developers in the future and how that's going to change. I don't know.
Yeah, I feel like I'm hearing that some of the tools are getting really good at building very small, almost like micro applications. And so I think that you probably get more people who aren't full-time developers, I think, building applications that don't have to be big commercial successes, but scratch their itch. I feel like there's some interesting opportunities there. And I think that there's still work to be done when it comes to the professional developers that are going to be using these tools. I'm going to date myself, but when we all started working with HTML, back when there were dinosaurs roaming the earth, the big thing that people wanted was WYSIWYG. What you see is what you get. They wanted a word processor that spit out HTML, and you would use some of these early tools, and you were like, "Oh, it's amazing!" And the demos looked amazing because it was WYSIWYG. And then you would spit out the code, and it was just a nightmare. Garbage. I think Microsoft had one, Front Page is what it was called. Anyways, it wasn't until like Adobe came along and they released their Dreamweaver tool, which they probably bought someone and put their name on it and improved it. But basically, it gave you the ability to toggle between WYSIWYG, like a editor, and down into the code level, and you could tweak it in either, jump back and forth between it and have two panes open, and you could toggle it and you could tweak it and you could see the updates live. I think we're going to go, we're going to eventually get going in those sort of directions where like the developers can have more ability to jump between the AI and the code itself and iterate on the code. And I think we're already getting there. And I think it's just going to keep improving in that direction. So don't judge. I don't think you should judge the AI coding tools based on a year ago, because that was sort of the front page, HTML experience, and now it's going to, they're going to figure it out, and it's going to get better.
Yeah, that's a really good. I really like that. That's a really interesting analogy, and you can kind of see that it's like even now, it's still. Of course, there's loads of like low code tools where you can just do everything by drag and drop, but there's still the place for developers, and it's the harder problems probably that you need the developers for.
Yeah, and just sometimes you just look at what when it's no code and you are trying to get it to do something, and you know how to do it in code, and yet they don't allow you to do it. I think that's where technical people get super frustrated, because they're like, I just know if I could get in there and tweak it a little bit, I know how to solve that, alignment problem, or I know how to solve that, that interaction that I'm trying to build.
Yeah. And maybe that's the analogous part on AI. Like, oh, if only it was trained on this stuff, then I don't know. Well, it knew what I knew. Yeah. Trained on our brains. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Super cool. Okay, amazing. Sid, if people want to learn more about you or they want to learn more about APIMatic, where should they go?
Oh, wow. Yeah, so I would say for APIMatic, just head over to apimatic.io, and you can check out some of the free tools that we have, like the VS Code extension. We have something that will transform your other API spec formats into OpenAPI or back. We're talking RAML and Blueprint and some of these other or older Swagger formats. And we even have a free tool that'll score and give you like a 0 to 100% rating on how ready your API definition is for generating code. And then you can try out the tool itself, but there's a lot of free stuff there as well. And there's also a link to my podcast, which is called The Art of Developer Experience. And my most recent guest, amazing thought leader, Jack Bridger. And so you can get that episode once it's been released. So that'll be fun. And I'm on LinkedIn. You can always go and connect with me there and ask questions. I love talking DX, but I've been doing DevRel for over 10 years. So I have lots of thoughts on how to build community and build tools for developers, since I've been doing that for a while and working with some pretty fun companies along the way.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much, Sid. And thanks everyone for listening. We'll see you again next time.